Hey, good morning, everybody. Nice to see all of you and Happy New Year. Thank you and welcome to Partners in Diversity's Breakfast for Champions. We get a lot of things passed down from our parents and grandparents, everything from our physical traits and personalities to traditions and secret family recipes. And then there are those things we can't see, like trauma. For people of color and people who have been marginalized and discriminated against throughout history, the impact of that trauma can be felt for generations. One study, for instance, found that grandchildren of Holocaust survivors were overrepresented by about 300% in referrals to psychiatric care. Several studies of Native American populations found that decades of assimilation, violence, and loss have been associated with behavioral health challenges in later generations, including increased risk of substance abuse, depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. These wounds come from injustice. And we all know that unhealed wounds can fester. If you have employees, coworkers, or friends who carry these wounds with them every day, they can affect their work, their behavior, and their well-being. We call this intergenerational trauma. So in order for us as employers, coworkers, friends, to help create a safe, inclusive environment, we have to understand intergenerational trauma. Today, Partners in Diversities is pleased to bring you a group of diversity, equity, and inclusion advocates to share their experiences with you and to discuss ways to build a trauma-informed workplace. The panel discussion will be led by D'Angela Wells, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Portland General Electric, where she works to make meaningful cultural changes. She has more than 30 years of human resources management experience. Before we get to D'Angela and the panelists, we are going to learn a little more about intergenerational trauma so we have fundamental knowledge and language around this issue. To help us better understand intergenerational trauma is Liliana Luna. Liliana merges ancestral knowledge with modern psychology to provide counseling and consulting services to the Latinx community. As an undocumented immigrant to the United States, Liliana uses her lived and learned experiences to connect with communities of similar backgrounds. In 2017, Liliana was awarded Women of Achievement by the Oregon State Commission for Women and was named a trailblazer for the undocumented DACA community. So please join me in welcoming Liliana Luna. Liliana?
Hello, good morning, everybody. I hope you all are getting your coffees ready and your breakfast ready as we join this conversation. Let me share with you my my screen to get started. So as you today we're going to be talking about understanding generational trauma and how, and by understanding generational trauma, we can get a sense and create a more trauma informed workplace. So welcome. As you heard, my name is Liliana Luna, and I think I got a pretty good understanding of what trauma is and how it feels like growing up. Growing up in Mexico, I grew up poor without a lot of access to food and house, and experiencing abuse while parents were working, then to the experience of immigrating to a new place like the United States, where the language was completely different, completely new, where the rules were very, very different. And once in the United States, I also faced a lot of discrimination, constantly hearing words like, you can't do this, words like, you should go back to your country. And I think that a mix of all the experiences really helped me understand how trauma feels and what trauma looks like. And that was a huge impact in my life. But it wasn't until I began my graduate studies when I was able to really put a name to my experiences. And the work that now I do with my clients as a counselor really helped me develop a passion for supporting people heal their own wounds and really heal their traumatic experiences. And that's what I do for work. I work with people, specifically the Latinx community, the undocumented communities, heal and liberate from their own traumas. So today, we're going to be talking more about trauma. What is trauma, right? And you can see how the American Psychological Association defines trauma. It is likely that you have experienced trauma, or you know somebody who has experienced trauma. And I want to invite you to experience this presentation, maybe from a personal experience, if you might. That way, this presentation is not only informational, but it would also take us a step closer towards understanding our healing and our own traumas. And you might ask, what is considered a traumatic event? Have I gone through a traumatic event? Well, I'm naming a couple of traumatic events that might be that you probably experienced, such as passing of a loved one, the passing of a pet, divorce, physical pain or injury, a severe car accident, exposure to war, experiencing a natural disaster, moving to a new location, parental abandonment, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, even prison stay. So all of these different experiences can create a traumatic event and a traumatic response. And the question is, can trauma be passed down from one generation to another? That is a question that, in terms of research on this topic, is considered new, but it is definitely uprising. Just like genetic conditions and physical characteristics get passed down from one family member to another, in some cases, trauma can also be inherited too. One of the first articles to note the presence of intergenerational trauma appeared in 1966. And this article specifically focused on documenting the high rates of psychological distress among children of Holocaust survivors. And we don't have to go that far in time. Let's focus on some recent work. For example, the work of Dr. Joy DeGruy, that has helped us understand the impacts of generations of slavery. Her work shows us that in the African American communities, generational trauma exists as a consequence of multi-generational oppression of Africans and their descendants, resulting from centuries of chattel slavery. So I want us to focus and shift our attention to a video that I want to show you by Dr. DeGruy. This video is going to show us a little bit more the impact and how does generational trauma really looks like.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on, and then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes, so 300 years of trauma, no help, freed, no help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children, and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about, he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African-American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment.
Thank you. So I like to use this example to show how generational trauma impact us, and we might not even know it. We might not even be aware that we are experiencing the consequences of generational trauma. And by now, you can get a sense that generational trauma is exactly what it sounds like. Processed trauma that isn't just experienced by one person, but it extends from one generation to the next. And as we heard Dr. DeGroote, after enduring trauma for generations, we find ways to adapt. And those survival adaptations can become part of our culture and even part of our personal values without even knowing. Personally, I recognize this adaptation in my own lineage. In my case, I was thought to be submissive in face of power. It was an adaptation that became a value that in my family that was passed down from one generation to another. And it was something that I couldn't understand. It wasn't until I learned that I come from a lineage of sex workers that I understood that this was a surviving mechanism that was passed down from a generation to another. And that's why my personal journey of healing is what draws me to working with our inner child. That part of us that remind us and that bring us closer to our childhood. And that's why I love to help people identify the root of their trauma. When working with the inner child, the root of the trauma is usually found in our childhood. And as the trauma, and we realize that the trauma was created by our own parents. Yes, our own parents can cause us trauma and is as a consequence of their own untreated trauma. And this is how trauma gets passed down from one generation to another until we find that one person that is willing and that has the resources and the access to look inwards and heal from within. And that's how we stop that generational trauma. And now I would like to focus on common trauma responses. It is important to know that intergenerational trauma affects all part of ourselves. We have to keep in mind that trauma is not a piece of cloth or an accessory that we can take off depending on the situation or depending on the setting. Just as personal values, trauma responses can become part of our life. It becomes a lens that we use to make sense of life. It becomes a sense of protection, a way that we can feel safer in life. Let's talk about a common trauma response, the fight, flight, and freeze. I'm pretty sure you have heard about it. It is our body's natural way to react to danger. It is a type of stress response that helps us respond to a perceived threat. The response instantly causes hormonal and physiological changes. Those changes allow you to act quickly so that you can protect yourself. It is a survival instinct. that was developed by our ancestors many years ago and was passed down from one generation to another. It is common to imagine this kind of trauma response when we are facing a physical threat, such as an accident or some sort of abuse. But I want us to think about it in the everyday life. How does this response look like when the threat is psychological? When it's a kind of threat that you live with, that you're not even conscious? For example, when we are looking into fighting, survivors who tend towards the fight response believe power will guarantee the security and perhaps guarantee the control that they didn't have in childhood. Fight looks like self-preservation at all costs. And I am pretty sure you have noticed people who that's their first defense mechanism. Fight, and making sure that they preserve the power that they did not have growing up. I see that very commonly in with my clients who have experienced a lot of injustices growing up. In terms of flight, survivors who tend towards the flight responses are usually chronically busy and perfectionist. They might believe being perfect is a way to receive love and prevent abandonment by people who are important in their lives. In the everyday, thinking about it, thinking about this trauma response in the everyday, fight can look like obsessive thinking or compulsive behavior, feeling of panic or anxiety, rushing around, being a workaholic, or even worrying and being unable to sit still and feel relaxed. It is part of the surviving mechanism. When a person experiences trauma, it is common that they also might go to a freeze state of being. Survivors who tend towards the freeze response are often mistrustful of others and generally find comfort in solitude. The freeze response might also refer to feeling physically or mentally frozen as a result of trauma, which people might experience as dissociation. And I remember experiencing this a lot, going from one space to another and knowing that I was there physically, but mentally and emotionally, I really don't know where I was. And maybe you can also maybe you have experienced it in your own space, in your own time, where you get on your car, you go from one place to another, and you have no idea how you got there. Because freeze looks like spacing out or feeling unreal, isolating yourself from the outside world, just being in your world and feeling safer that way. Now, I'm pretty sure that by now, a lot of us have heard about triggers. A trigger is a reminder of a past trauma. It is common that a person who experienced a traumatic event in their life experiences triggers even in the workplace. Before understanding triggers as a counselor, I first learned about the word trigger during a diversity council meeting at my former workplace. Triggers can be a memory or a physical sensation or even an emotion. For example, say you are exercising and your heart starts pounding. That sensation of your heart pounding might remind you of a time where you were running from an abusive partner, and that would be considered an internal trigger. Now, let's talk about common trauma responses in the workplace. As you heard, triggers and activation is a pretty common trauma response in the workplace, and you might see that in your workplace with coworkers reacting and feeling activated. I was consciously I wanted to include gossip as a common trauma response, because it is destructive behavior in adults that really mimics the impulsive quality of childlike behavior. And I really see that a lot in my clients that are dealing with traumatic events that happen in childhood. It is kind of like we are a 40, 30, 50-year-old person really acting as a 5, 6, 7-year-old kid. And that is a pretty common trauma response. The lack of collaboration, defensiveness, passive hostility, self-sabotage, and self-defeating patterns are all common trauma responses. And I want us to think about, how does that look like in my workplace? And now that we have a better understanding on how trauma works on a personal level, let's talk about the impact of trauma in the workplace. Research shows that when a person is under extreme stress, they become less flexible, less creative. In this state, survivors of trauma operate at only a fraction of their creative and productive potential. And this is because people who have experienced trauma and it has not been processed or resolved are focused on surviving. They are not focused on long-term goals or the well-being of others. And you can probably notice that in yourself when you're feeling very stressed out. You have very limited capacity. Now imagine somebody that has been carrying that for generations. Let's look at some clear examples of how trauma impacts the workplace. And I hope that you can identify some of them in your own teams. So when it comes to dealing with change, we know that adaptability to embrace and respond to rapid change is needed for companies to survive in general. We all need to know how to deal with change. When a person is in survival mode, it is very likely that they might come across as rigid or territorial, and they might want to stick to the old ways. And when it comes to creativity, at the most basic intellectual level, trauma strips a person of their creative capacities. Studies on creativity show that a low threat environment is essential for creative thought. When people are feeling threatened, their thought process becomes very rigid. When it comes to teamwork, the interpersonal arena is often the most challenging aspect of work for people. Qualities which lead to productive interactions, such as being vulnerable, honest, and open, are not easy when a person is in survival mode. Of course, this interpersonal style doesn't help when it comes to bringing a team together, and you probably have experienced it in your own teams. When it comes to learning environment, even if the workplace is a positive workplace, the cumulative effect of employees' previous trauma needs to be addressed in order for us to achieve a positive learning environment. So with the information on trauma, generational trauma, the trauma that gets passed down from one generation to another, let's keep in mind, the trauma shapes us, but trauma does not define us. Some people who experience even the most extreme traumatic events are still able to be resilient. I hope this information helps you create a more trauma-informed place. And let's keep in mind that building trust and displaying transparency are key to a trauma-informed place. For this reason, many businesses are embracing open and honest communication and more informal methods with their workforce to understand and address the current state of well-being, especially around these times, right? Keep in mind that peer and community support are powerful antidotes to trauma. When others share their personal experiences and their stories with each other, it creates a sense of connectedness, a sense of community, and it promotes healing. And let's remember that resilience is a powerful muscle that we can all build together. Keep in mind that trust and predictability helps alleviate trauma responses. This is a time when managers perhaps want to spend more one-on-one time with their staff. Regular check-in conversations that focus on listening to what each employee is managing and struggling with, acknowledging their feelings and experiences will help recalibrate expectations together and discuss resources for support so that employees can be productive while also maintaining their well-being. And it is important to note that a healing journey is very personal. It can be supported, but we have to remember that we cannot walk the journey for someone else. It is recommended to create avenues for your employees to request accommodations or resources and not feel guilt or shame over their needs. While they might be looking for flexible work policies and mental health resources, they might also need support for basic needs like housing, food security, and childcare. And not knowing where to turn or not feeling safe to ask for help creates even more stress. This can be reduced by providing a range of available resources and tools within your organization, as well as resources from the community. And again, I want to remind us that trauma can shape a person, but it does not define who we are. Thank you very much for listening to my brief presentation. Now I would like to invite my friend D'Angela. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liliana. Wow, that was a powerful. So again, thank you for helping us to better understand intergenerational trauma and for providing us with a foundational knowledge and common language. And apologies, I accidentally turned my video off, the joys of technology. So we now want to take a deeper dive into how intergenerational trauma affects individuals and in the workplace and the community, and what people and organizations can do to create a trauma-informed environment where everyone can thrive. My name is D'Angela Wells. I'm the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Portland General Electric, and I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator this morning. I'd like to have some folks join us, so let me introduce our esteemed panelists. We're going to start with Linda Castillo. She's the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager at the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization, better known as IRCO. She was also on the founding board of the Oregon Latino Network. So welcome, Linda. Next, we have Dr. Allison Empey, a pediatrician at OHSU. She's also the Deputy Director of the Northwest Native American Center of Excellence. Welcome, Dr. Empey. You've already met Liliana Luna, Executive Director of Esperanza Wellness Center. And last but not least, we have Peggy Nagai, owner of Peggy Nagai Consulting. She's also the co-founder of the Minoru Yasui Legacy Project. So thank you all for being here and for being vulnerable in this space. We want to be mindful and caring of each other, as this is a very sensitive topic, as we've heard. So let's jump in with our questions, and we'll start with Linda and Dr. Empey. Liliana just shared a great deal of background on intergenerational trauma. To the extent that you feel comfortable, can you spend a couple of minutes sharing your story of intergenerational trauma, what it means for you personally? Let's start with Dr. Empey, and then we'll go to Linda.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me to be here. And so you've asked me to share kind of my experiences with intergenerational trauma. Well, I am a citizen of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. And so I am from one of the 9 federally recognized tribes that we have here in Oregon. And really, when I think about intergenerational trauma, I think about all of the kind of historic events to my ancestors that happened. Those include the forced relocations that we had, being forced onto reservations that was not our ancestral lands. My tribe specifically was terminated, and so was not considered a federally recognized tribes for a number of years, from the 1950s until the 1980s. And that's kind of where I come from it. So during that time, the 1950s to the 1980s, when we were terminated, we really lost a ton of our culture in my family. And so we grew up well, my mom, sorry, my mom grew up on what would have been our reservation. But because it had been taken away from us, she didn't really have a community place to gather to learn those cultural traditions. My grandmother actually attended Chemawa Indian boarding school. And so Indian boarding schools were actually created to assimilate Native Americans into the white mainstream culture. And my grandmother attended that, and she lost a lot of her culture there as well. You weren't supposed to speak your native language. You weren't supposed to practice your cultural practices. And so when she left the Indian boarding school, she didn't have that cultural knowledge to pass on to our family and to my mom. And then my mom, because of that, not having that land, that community place to gather, additionally further lost some of that cultural knowledge. And so that's often what I think about when I think about how it has really impacted me, and how there's really been kind of a cultural revitalization that's happening in my tribe, in my family, personal family as well, in myself, and reconnecting to my culture, and really drawing strength from that that I didn't even know existed because that wasn't passed down to me. So that's a little bit about my personal story.
Thank you for sharing that, Allison. Linda, how about you?
Morning, everyone. Well, my ancestors in my family are from Mexico, and we have a long history of actually traveling what is, back and forth through what is now known as the United States. Back in 1848, the US and Mexico signed a treaty, the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty. And at that point, Mexico lost 55% of its territory. And those are now the 7 states that are in the southwestern part of Mexico. Why that's important is because my ancestors, my family was used to traveling back and forth through a territory without borders. And so that's why you often hear this phrase, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And so we have a history of that kind of experience of having our lands removed from us, history of colonization with the Spanish and the French. So a lot of displacement, a lot of change, a lot of, cultural pressure to lose indigenous languages and indigenous ways, and really, become more co-opted into a Spanish culture. And in our community, we have a pretty diverse color range in terms of, folks who are very light, such as myself, considered white presenting. There's a word, güera, I'm the fair one. And then all the way to folks who are from African descent. So there's Afro-Latino in our community. And in my family, we have that whole range of color. And I think for some folks, that's very confusing when they see us and they're like, folks have an idea of what they think Latino, Chicano looks like. And so it's an opportunity for some information and education. But as my parents traveled back and forth, as they were young, their parents died at a very early age. And so that left them with a lot of responsibility to care for their siblings. And so they traveled into the United States and worked here, migrated here within programs known as, for example, the Bracero program. In Spanish, brazo is arm. So the Bracero program was really, arm labor to come and work the fields and do that kind of work. So they would come, do that work, apples, cotton, whatever it was. And the very horrible thing that would happen often is, folks would be scheduled to be paid at the end of the month or maybe every couple of weeks. And invariably, the farm owner would say, I'm sorry, I can't pay you. After someone has invested all of that time and worked, and then threatened with deportation, and then they would be shipped out. So this was a constant experience that my folks, had to endure. So there was that wage theft, there was harassment, there was, a great deal of racism, a lot of bias at work. My parents over time, moved from being farm workers to service workers. Then my dad eventually became a manager at Ford Motor Company. My mother was an early pioneer in the Silicon Valley, putting together the circuit boards. So over time, there was this, this movement. But in that time, there was still a lot of incredible stress and dehumanizing treatment at work with coworkers and that kind of thing. And so I would say during all of this experience, there was really what we call some pretty significant forms of adverse childhood experiences, such as abuse and neglect, and challenges such as substance abuse, parents who divorced, incarceration of family members who were involved in gang activities. So a lot of different things. And so what we know and what I experienced in my family is that we're pretty vulnerable to these kind of social and economic kinds of conditions that we live in. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you both for sharing. As you were speaking, I was thinking about some of my own experiences, and I'm struck by the commonalities and the common threads that run through all of our stories, even though we are different races. So thank you for sharing. The other word that comes to mind for me, you mentioned vulnerable, is resilience, and how resilient our ancestors were, and we are today as well. So let's continue the discussion about trauma. This question is for you, Liliana. Many of us experience different forms of trauma and walk around triggered and don't even know it. And I think you said earlier that you didn't recognize your own trauma until later in life. How did you recognize it, and what are some signs that people should look for in themselves and in others?
Yes, thank you for that question. I remember the first experiences I had with being triggered was at my old workplace. And I realize now is because I was reliving a lot of my childhood trauma related to humiliation and injustice. And I didn't know that at that point. I was just experiencing. I remember going to specific meetings, meeting with the specific people, and my body would start shaking. And I thought it was out of stress. I thought it was out of just being tired. But my body spoke louder and louder and louder until I couldn't continue working at that space. And at that point, I didn't know what was going on with me. I just continued to blame it on stress. Specifically, my body would start feeling super sweaty. Like I said, shaking. It got to a point where as I would drive into my workspace, my body would start feeling like I would start feeling smaller, 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 and my body will shake that I would have to take some time before entering the workspace. I had heard of the word triggered for the first time in a diversity council meeting at my previous workplace. And while I knew what it was and the definition of it, I didn't know how it felt. I couldn't put the two together. And it wasn't until I started my grad program as I was preparing to become a counselor that I was able to put the two together. My past experience with trauma was being triggered by current experiences that really mimicked what I experienced growing up. Like I mentioned, humiliation and injustice. A lot of it was part of it. And at that moment, when I put the two together, that's when I decided to open the door, to healing. And that's where my healing journey began. And I would recommend for people who do not know how does triggering feel like, I just want to say, let's listen to our body. Let's listen to our body, because our body is so smart. Our body has memories that we don't even consciously, we cannot even put together. And our body might feel uneasy on a physical, some of the physical signs might be, like I said, shaking, sweating, lack of concentration. I also remember experiencing a lot of like little pimples all over my body, and I would just want to like be scratching and scratching. And again, I thought it was some sort of nervousness. On the emotional level, feeling anxious, feeling, experiencing fear. All of those are things that we experience and we might just ignore. But I think it's important when it comes to dealing with not only triggers, but going into the root of the trauma. It's important to recognize what our body is the messages that our body is sending us, because we might be, facing a huge trauma and we might not even know. Like it happened to me.
Such good information. Thank you too for sharing your personal experience. There's a term out there that many of you may be familiar with, and it's called mindfulness. And you're really being mindful about what's happening with you. I was thinking about children, even children who are victims, if you will, to intergenerational trauma, sometimes might be acting out in different ways, and it gets interpreted one way when in fact the root of it is something else. And I appreciate your comments about, really trying to be mindful and thoughtful, understanding what's going on with yourself, and then digging deeper to understand what the root cause is. So Peggy, we'd like to hear a little bit from you. Your grandparents and parents and extended family were all incarcerated during World War II because they looked like the enemy. As a third generation Japanese American, you and I have had a number of previous conversations. And you said that, especially when you were younger, you experienced trauma every December 7th on Pearl Harbor Day, because there'd be headlines in the newspaper that made you feel like an outsider. Lately, there have been references to January 6th being similar to December 7th as days that we will forever remember. And you had a reaction to that reference. First of all, tell us why you felt that way and what you hope that people around you would have done to make you feel less like an outsider.
Thanks, D'Angela. It's great to be here and really to think about this and explore my own experiences. I grew up in Boring, Oregon. Most people here probably know, but outside of the state of Oregon, they don't know where Boring is. They think it's an adjective for the state of Oregon, and it's not, it's actual place. I grew up on a farm without indoor plumbing and eating government surplus food in the winter because we didn't have enough food to eat. And all that to say, growing up Japanese American as well as growing up poor had the lots of intersectionality issues that came up. But on December 7th, when I was younger, there would be headlines in the Oregonian saying about Pearl Harbor Day and all that. And my parents didn't talk about the trauma that they experienced. They didn't talk about World War II. They didn't talk about being incarcerated. My mother was 19, my father was 22. They could take only as much as they could carry. And we didn't learn about it in school, or what we did learn in school was it was for their own good or their own protection. So there was not only intergenerational trauma, but I guess a lack of understanding about what happened, the culture, the trauma itself, and how it impacted my parents and the generation and all my relatives. So I would dread kind of going to school. I would feel because I was the only kid of color in my class from the first to the 12th grades, I very much felt physically looked and felt like an outsider as well. And as other people were talking, I realized that the symptoms that came out were kind of on the perfectionism, you have to work hard. But I also remember when I grew up wanting to be white and wishing that I was white. And if you think about that, and I think about that poor little girl who was not going to be white, but was wishing she was going to be white, how sad that really is. And how unaccepting of herself, just her, let alone anything else, her physical self, and the differences. Um, and I also think that what happened is, if you don't get educated about what happened, it's it's hard to understand it, especially when you're a little kid. And so, I mean, I kind of self-taught myself the history, and have done that a lot because it was not taught in school. Or if it was taught, I remember my seventh grade teacher said it was for their own protection. It was for their own, well-being. And that was a teacher I didn't get along with, and so putting those things together, but also lately, I think, we were talking about natural disasters. I think we just went through a national disaster. And I don't mean just the pandemic, I mean the Trump administration. And I realized on Inauguration Day that it felt like the end of an abusive relationship. Now, people may not agree with that, that's fine, but that was my experience. And how it relates to Japanese American history is that the government, this US government, incarcerated their own citizens. And I had the honor of representing Minoru Yasui, who grew up in Hood River, Oregon, who went to the U of O Law School, was the first Japanese American member of the Oregon State Bar. And at the age of 25, he intentionally violated the military curfew in World War II to test its constitutionality. And I think that when your government, as Allison knows, and everybody else on this panel knows, as you well know, D'Angela, it's one thing to have people not like you personally. When your own country and your own government sanctions discrimination and trauma against your group of people, and then to find out through that case that the government argued it was based on military necessity, but we found the documents in the National Archives that said it wasn't based, the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans was not based on military necessity, but it was based on race. And the general of the Western Defense Command, DeWitt, said the Japanese race is an enemy race. A Jap is a Jap. And no matter how long they had to decide, you can't separate the goats from the sheep. So, this whole idea of it was war and there was a time and it was stressful and therefore we had to round up everybody was not true. And he said as much. It didn't matter how much time. And so I guess realizing that vindicated, I think, us, but on the same time, it's just horrible, as we all know on this panel, that your own country could do that to yourself and then induce, it's like trauma inducement, and perpetuate it and not acknowledge it. And so I think this national disaster and I didn't realize it, re-traumatized a part of me. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Peggy, for sharing, and this idea about a national disaster and being re-traumatized. I can relate to that. I remember Inauguration Day, and what an amazing day. I had a friend email me and say, did you cry tears of joy? It's like joy, relief, hope. I mean, like a flood of emotions, right? And so when I got off work, I actually ended a little bit early, about 5:30. And I said, good night, honey, I'm going to bed. And he's like, you're going to bed? I was exhausted, from just, I think everything just kind of showed up at once. So let's continue on with this theme around impact. And thank you for sharing the personal impact that this has hat on you. Let's talk about workforce, workplace, and community impact. What are some present day harmful experiences in the workplace or community that might affect people's experiences of intergenerational trauma? And this question is to all of you. Present day harmful experiences in the workplace or community that might affect people's experiences or intergenerational trauma.
Maybe I'll go ahead and start if that's okay. I think, I think some of the harmful present day experiences are also, again, historical. Oregon has a long history of excluding Black people, Native people, and other people of color. So I think we can't ignore that because it's an experience, a history that continues through attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that show up in different places in our community, in our work, and folks we encounter. And so I think we all would benefit greatly from learning about that history and how much of it was in the Constitution, in amendments, in community compact agreements, and just all these things around being able to write contracts or owning property, something as recent as, just in the last decade. So I think there's just so much of it that I think is just under the surface that people don't know about, but we certainly as communities of color have been impacted by them greatly. And I think the other piece of just harmful experiences are just the ongoing sense of persecution that people feel around not being able to feel comfortable or trust their environment. Communities that always have this fear of being attacked in some way or deported. There was a time in history in California where a number of folks, thousands and thousands of folks, were actually rounded up and deported and repatriated. Many of them were US citizens. So there is a long history of folks not feeling comfortable or feeling like they can just be and settle. So I think that's also something that carries over into this experience of being in a workplace that is dominant culture. The spaces and the places are dominant culture. The work culture is very individualistic versus collective. There's this experience of bigger space bubbles. You have to kind of really go around people. There's not a sense of closeness or intimacy, the focus on product versus relationship, that people are expendable, we're a commodity. And we have a long history of treating people as commodities and property. And so that all just is all triggering, feeling ignored, feeling silenced, minimized, undermined, gaslit. I mean, there's all these experiences. So for us to come into a workplace, we're all very hypervigilant of what's happening and how we, in some ways, learn to code switch, to understand what's happening here and what I'm here, and trying to remain very authentic to that, but you want to survive. So I think all of that is just a very complex recipe for us in terms of how we come into a space.
Thank you, Linda. Anyone else want to respond to that question?
Well, I will, D'Angela, because a whole bunch of things went through my mind as Linda was talking about that. But when the president of the United States calls it Kung flu or Wuhan virus or the China virus, I'm reminded about the other virus that started in, I can't remember the name of the virus, but it started in North Carolina. And it was from hogs. And we didn't call that the North Carolina white hog farmers virus or the North Carolina virus. So that connection to the impact of saying those words that somehow is their fault. You could see it in the physical safety and lack of safety that Asians have faced in the pandemic, even doctors and nurses that were spit on, but people yelling at them to go home. And I think that for me, what I've seen is that Latinos and Asians are seen as permanently foreign, that we're not quite US citizens, that we're considered foreign to this country. And the other thing, at least for Asians, is that how we're treated is oftentimes how the country of our ancestors, that geopolitical connection to the US and how well they are doing with the US impacts us as American citizens from ancestors from that country. And I also was thinking with what Linda said, that my grandparents could not become naturalized citizens. The Supreme Court said if you're not white, you can't become a citizen. And so they were in this country for 40 years before they could become naturalized citizens in the 1950s. And so that community, that sense of lack of safety based on laws and rules. And then the last thing I would say is that I think the other trauma that happens is if you're not quiet and submissive, like you should as a nice Asian woman, then you get the backlash of, it rhymes with rich, or you're not supposed to do that. You're not supposed to be that way. You're supposed to stay in line. And I've faced that a lot. And consequently, I've left a lot of organizations because I was not willing to be treated in that fashion. So those are some of my experiences.
Thank you for sharing, Peggy. We're going to move on to the next question. I have a question for Dr. Empey, although I'm not sure if she's still with us. She is a doctor at OHSU. And she's there. I was going to say, I don't know if you had something that you had to run and do. But colonialism and the forced removal of indigenous people from their lands have lasting effect on families. In Oregon, the Donation Land Act of 1850 spurred a migration of white settlers into the territory of offering up 320 acres per man for free, or 640 for married couples, which in effect displaced tribes and indigenous people from prime land. How might the effects of trauma from the past and present interact or combine to shape the current issues faced by indigenous people? And how does this connect to the current social and health issues?
Thank you. And I just have to comment before I get started, and maybe a topic for another day, about how the Oregon Donation Land Act gave land to men, but not women. That's for another day. But thank you for that question. I talked a little bit earlier about land and forced relocations, but the tribes here in Oregon, really their culture is based on the lands in which they live. So when you think about the technologies they were working on in order to gain their food that they ate. So you think about I think specifically about the Columbia River and the fishing along there, those technologies, the languages they spoke, so the neighboring tribes nearby, and many of their cultural practices were land-based. And so to lose that and to be removed from that area was really hard on tribes. Additionally, many of them were moved to areas where they didn't know how to forage for food in those new areas. And when you think about, the food insecurity that caused, the poverty that caused. I think we talked a little bit about the 1950s Determination Act. They actually would remove families from their reservations and move them into cities to assimilate them. They gave them no skills to be able to navigate being in these new cities when they were coming from these reservations that now no longer existed, and disconnected them from their families, from their cultures. And so that really has lasting effects on families. I see families who are coming back to the to my tribal area, having been forced away and not having the money or the resources to be able to return home. And so many of them just feel this sense of relief to be able to be back near our culture and to be not on our ancestral lands, but closer to our ancestral lands than before. And can you remind me, what was the second part of that question?
The second part of the question was, how does this connect to the current social and health issues?
Yes. Well, I think a lot of, being forced to those reservations led to a lot of poverty. And during, we talk about Indian fry bread. For those of you who don't know what that is, that actually is made from commodity food that was dropped off on reservations for tribes. That was for survival. I often talk with my family that that's not, the food that our bodies are used to. That was us in survival mode. And so I often think about many of the impacts of that on our overall health. When we think about Native Americans, I think about, some of the bigger issues, type 2 diabetes, and how being removed from our land and our ability to gather our native foods there contributed to some of the health issues that we're seeing today.
Thank you, Allison. My next question is for you, Liliana. You see the impact of intergenerational trauma regularly with your clients in the Latino community, many of whom have come to the United States and face a stereotype that they're only capable of doing low-wage jobs. How does that affect the mental well-being of those individuals and how they show up at work?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Sayers. That's something that I see pretty regularly, and not only with people in the workforce, but I see a lot of college students dealing with that in the classroom. And the problem is that people, and I include myself in this process of healing, people believe those stereotypes and they embrace the idea that they are only capable of doing low wage jobs. And that's the problem that we get used to it. And as I mentioned with intergenerational trauma, sometimes the ways that we cope with trauma become part of our culture, part of a way that we are, and describes who we are, and we really believe it. So I work with individuals in really going deeper into this idea. And some of these beliefs might come from society. Some of these beliefs might also come from messages they heard growing up, as we saw in the video with Dr. DeGrew. Is those messages that we receive that make us feel that we might not be enough and that we're not deserving. And unfortunately, some of those messages come from parents due to their own unsolved trauma. And it's not always right, but it shows up. And so when it comes to fear and failure in the workplace, in school, I invite my clients to recognize that voice that is inside of them. And I want to invite you to, all of you who are part of this presentation. I know for all of us, there is this book that really helped me understand that we all do self-talk, some sort of self-talk. When you see yourself in the mirror, you have some sort of opinion about yourself. What kind of opinion do you have? What kind of talk do you have with yourself? So when it comes to, like I said, failure and fear and in the workplace, I ask my clients to recognize that voice, to pay attention to that voice, to become aware of that voice that often leads to self-sabotage, and recognize, who does that voice remind you of? Is it your mom? Is it your dad? Is it like this person in the community? Is it this TV show? What, like, who does this voice remind you of? Because we need to get it out of there. We need to get it out of your mind. We need to get it out of there. And instead, we need to bring your own voice that is full of empowerment, that is full of who you are. So that's what I work with that's how I work with my clients. And there is this idea of the imposter syndrome that that a lot of my clients come with, and it refers to this internal experience of believing that, you know, we might not be as competent as others, even if others perceive us that way, and it's constantly dealing with that, right? And it's a work in progress, and like I mentioned, it's the very first step is to become aware, and in terms of how it affects in the workplace, you know, while some people might experience, you know, low performance at their job due to these voices inside of them, I cannot do it, I'm gonna mess it up, my boss might ask me to do this job, but I'm not gonna be able to do it. And again, like we you know, this voice, you know, leads us to self-sabotaging consequences. There are other clients that are very resilient, and they use their traumatic experiences as gasoline to impulse their journey, you know, their healer journey, their journey, you know, at work. So I just want to make sure that we know that while traumatic events can impact a person in a very negative way, as we have heard, there is also another group of people who uses the traumatic events as gasoline to continue moving forward. So, you know, it shows up in different ways for my clients, but I think what I mentioned and what I recommend everybody, having someone to walk, you know, someone you can walk with as you're walking this journey of healing is very important. Thank you.
Thank you. I love what you said about recognizing that voice and recognizing where those messages are coming from, and then countering those and turning the volume up on your messages to yourself. Thank you for that. There are a lot of reasons that employees of color get triggered at work, and sometimes they feel like they can't do anything about it. One day recently, after the murder of George Floyd, I was extremely triggered. And so here I found myself in the position of being the director for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and being expected to, it was my job, to lead my company through this very difficult moment. But I was dealing with my own stuff. I'm remembering my uncle who was beat up for something he didn't do, and until the day he died, was never right mentally. I remember the young man who was the ring bearer in my wedding, who was also beat up, same scenario. So this is really real stuff. And then you come to work, and in my case, I was expected to lead. Fortunately, there were a couple of days where I just couldn't have my camera on. I forced myself. It's like, this is your job. You have to show up, you have to do it. But I couldn't have my camera on. And fortunately, I had a boss, my VP, who is culturally competent and understood and was willing to carry the water for me during that time. So there are times when we get triggered. I felt like I could say something about it, but there are times when employees of color are triggered at work and they don't feel like they can say anything or do anything about it. So Linda, what are some of the reasons that those employees might feel that way and feel like there isn't anything they can do about it? It's not safe to speak up.
Yeah. So first, let me say that not only people of color are triggered, but other communities, mainstream communities, are triggered. And so there's this experience of hurt people. You know, it's kind of a confluence of things that can happen back and forth. But the very multi-layered, complex equation for communities of color is that it's not only the adverse childhood experiences they may have, the traumas they may have, but just the adverse community experiences that they have as well around poverty or discrimination or any kind of community disruption or, you know, catalytic kind of event or violence. I mean, all of these things are kind of just multi-layered for folks, plus the intergenerational things in the history. And, you know, people can have these traumatic kinds of experiences, but again, as I said, it's very multi-layered. So I think, you know, for us as employees of color, the things that we really need to think about is just, you know, what work we're doing for ourselves. Because I often hear it's like, you know, those people should just get therapy and get over it, you know, and it's not that. It's much more complex. It's institutional, it's systemic. So we can do as much as we can do to be self-aware and increase our knowledge and, you know, try to be as conscious of the unconscious things that are happening. But there are other things outside of us that continue to happen that trigger us, such as issues of position and power, you know, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, this dominant culture, which really in some ways can be so rigid that it doesn't have the level of flexibility to be culturally, you know, have that cultural humility or that responsiveness that our community needs. And being able to be in a place where, you know, the rules are made by a certain community and it gets reinforced that we have to abide by them in a certain way, and it really restricts us. So I think for folks, that's what triggers us a great deal. We start to feel, you know, that our culture, our race, or any of other differences isn't tolerated. We don't feel safe. We don't feel safe to bring our whole selves to work. There's different parts of ourselves that we have to compartmentalize to be able to be in a space. And again, that's what I meant by that code switching. There's some things that you take out to be able to function and other things that you can bring to be in other places. And, you know, imagine that, you know, you have like, you know, your luggage and no, I can't take that, but I can take this, you know? And so you're traveling around deciding and really, you know, scoping out situations about where you can be you, which is exhausting, you know? And so you see that just in just that sense of hypervigilance, and if you're safe at work, and, you know, lack of safety, and you do have the protections to be safe there. I think some other things that we think about is just, you know, even though folks may feel that experience of not being able to speak up or a sense of retaliation, a lot of that comes from just this lack of transparency or trustworthiness at work. So how do we develop spaces and places where we can begin to see transparency in our workplace, have a sense of power and agency, and to create change in our workplace? You know, there's a number of other, you know, factors that are really important for us to think about that would help reduce that triggering effect. But again, it's all within a fishbowl, that there's triggering that happens back and forth. And I think as communities and organizations particularly become more trauma informed, there's an increased awareness and sensitivity to that, and certain things that organizations can do to begin to change that experience so that folks can feel more present and feel like they belong in their workplace.
Great. Thank you, Linda. I have many more questions. This is a great conversation. I love hearing about the experiences that each of you have had, but I imagine that our audience also has questions today. So I want to open it up to questions from the audience, and I'm going to turn it over to Mari to help facilitate those.
Great, thanks, D'Angela, and thanks, panel. This has been completely awesome. So thank you for sharing your personal stories and experiences. So there is a question, when you think of an employee is having a trauma response that is creating challenges for them at work, how do you address it as a supervisor? I don't want to shame them or layer consequences on their behavior. I do want to acknowledge the possibility and provide resources for healing. Are there best practices for encouraging self-reflection while disarming the triggered response? Who would like to answer that?
I can get it started, and if anybody else want to join. And it's specifically because I think that this is a very, very important topic that can help prevent more trauma from happening, or it can actually, you know, bring more trauma to the team. So this is very important. In answering this question, a memory comes to my mind of when, as an undocumented person, now I have DACA, and it was probably, I can't remember, back 2-3 years ago, I don't remember, when DACA, which is a work permit, a work authorization in, here in the United States, when DACA was being there was a legal issue with DACA, whether should he stay, should it not stay, and I was very triggered. I was going through a lot of emotional. I was experiencing a lot emotionally, and it definitely impacted my workplace, my performance at my workplace. And my former supervisor wanted to give it a try and help me feel better by saying, yeah, I understand how you're feeling, but you need to change, you need to do this, you need to do that. And of course, this person did not understand, because this person actually had documents, and this person was born here. And at that point, I was experiencing the deportation of a loved one, and this person, of course, could not understand. So with that being said, I think that when it comes, I think your question has different aspects, right? Of intention, good intention of dismantling this idea of these triggers, right? Like dismantling the trigger response, and kind of supporting the employee. I think that when we have these great intentions, I think that it's important to have a relationship, first of all, with the employee. It's important that we have a meaningful relationship. Now, what does that mean? I mean, and all of us can think about it. If we think about, being the employee, we can smell it. We see, we know who really, has, genuine interest in our performance, or who's just, interested in just checking in with you and move forward. Like, let's move on. So I recommend that if you are genuinely interested in helping, generally be interested. Because we can sense it, we can smell it, and that in itself can create more trauma because we can, again, like relieve different experiences from childhood or from the past. So create that meaningful relationship and generally be interested. I think that that's a very good step. I think when it comes to talking about the behavior, or recognizing that this person perhaps is being impacted by their own trauma responses, and their work is being impacted by their trauma responses, I think it's important to have that conversation. And somewhere in there, let's recognize our privilege. And we all have all kinds of privilege. As an undocumented person in the United States, I still hold privilege. So let's just recognize the different privileges that we hold, and let's begin that conversation, that way as well. Feeling genuinely interested in recognizing our privilege. And then I would say also, let's troubleshoot together. Let's not do it from top to bottom. Let's not say this is what I because imagine you come up, you say, hey, I just went to a presentation and I think that you are being triggered and your trauma response is impacting your work. That can come across as very top down, and that in itself is triggering as well. We just have to think about it this way. Think about and this is what has helped me be a lot more compassionate in life. When I experience somebody who is being triggered, or somebody who is being super defensive, I do not see that person. I don't see that person. I recognize that the person is being defensive and that is being triggered. But what I'm able to see is behind the triggers, behind the defense mechanisms, I see a little kid. I see a little kid that is super afraid, that is scared to speak up, that perhaps was beat up growing up, that perhaps was abandoned. We don't know. So we need to be very delicate with people who walk around with their defense mechanisms, because behind that defense mechanism there is a hurt person. So let's treat that person as a hurt person, with a lot of compassion and a lot of care, just as you would with a loved one, your kid, if you have, or your pet, or whatever comes to your mind. Let's treat that person with that level of care. And I think that that's what we really need. I think that's what would make a difference. But then again, I think Linda mentioned it, right? How can a hurt person be able to hold space for another hurt person? And that is why I think we all need to do our work. We need to heal our own trauma so that we can be able to hold emotions and space for others. That's what I would say.
Thank you. D'Angela, in your role in the HR world, do you have any suggestions for our listeners on coaching, reviews, or helping these managers and supervisors, if they feel like they have an employee that has been triggered, how do they help them?
Yes. So I would say the thing that you don't want to do is ignore them or not mention it, not acknowledge, and then also not make assumptions. So I agree with Liliana. It's important to do a check-in, and the word curiosity is an important word to take with you. Go in curious. Don't assume you have answers. Don't assume you know. Don't assume they're like the person of color who is your neighbor or who is your friend. They may be they may handle things completely different. So go in curious and just simply ask, how are you doing? And then if they want to talk, great, follow their lead. If they don't want to talk, just give them space. Let them know that you're there to support them and that you're there to listen. So I think that's probably I could give a long list of advice, but I think that's probably my best concise advice.
Thank you. So there's a question. Can you speak to the role of epigenetics in intergenerational trauma? Allison, would this go to you?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak about this. So there is growing evidence that it actually can change our genetics and that these can be passed along to offsprings when we have trauma. We often talk about the 7 generations. I think I also want to be really clear and important that when I talk about this with my patients or with my families, I often also talk about the ways that we can break this trauma. Because I think it can be really overwhelming to families to hear, oh my goodness, like this, I could be passing this along to my child. And so I really focus on those ways that we can break that. And those are those, and I'm in pediatrics, so those are those strong relationships with their parents and really focusing on that and having a positive influence in their life to break that. And so I want to be clear that I also try to focus on that as well.
Thank you, Allison. So this will have to be the last question. In an effort to start to develop a trauma-informed culture in the workplace, what would you recommend as some first steps to help people become comfortable simply starting a dialogue? Peggy, Linda?
I would say, I think the first thing is that it's really important to begin to understand what is trauma, stress, and recognize and acknowledge that there's an impact and a harm, and recognize our role in this individually or systemically and how it causes harm. So really getting up to speed and understanding what this whole important area is about. Trauma-Informed Oregon is through the state of Oregon, provides trainings throughout the state of Oregon around trauma-informed care. And that might be one place to at least get like an introduction to trauma-informed care so that organizations, excuse me, can begin to think about how they would infuse that into their workplace, into their organization. And there's a whole, continuation of how this can be done with several levels of training, getting staff to be trained as train the trainers. At IRCO, I and another staff member are train the trainers, and we're infusing this throughout our organization. Additionally, I think folks should just read as much as possible about trauma. There's one book in particular that I want to recommend titled The Body Keeps Score. It's a Brain, Mind, and Body and Healing of Trauma by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. I think it's one way to really begin to look at that body-mind connection and how that has a whole big difference for us in our community. So getting informed, looking at practices, changing the policies, and really changing the relationship and the climate in an organization is a tall order, but there's got to be a start to this journey.
And Mari, I would say that especially in Oregon, where the percentage of white people is so high, that that it's important for white people to educate themselves, to realize that white fragility is there. I remember a white male saying to me after during this whole thing and the executive order that came down, and I said, uh, I am adhering to the executive order under protest. That was the executive order from Trump that said you can't talk about white privilege, you can't talk about diversity, blah, blah, blah. And I said, I'm doing this under protest. And one of my colleagues, who's a white male, said, I fully understand how you feel. And I said to him, no, you don't. You don't understand. And he was highly offended by what I said. He was highly offended. He called me back. He said, you embarrassed me in public, etc. But really, what I was running into and what he was running into was white fragility. And I know that in the best of intentions, that white people might want to help people of color, but they need to help themselves. They need to educate themselves. They need to understand that the condition of white supremacy is a condition that permeates everything in our life. And it's not a person with a white robe on. It's a condition that we have to deal with. And I think that is so important rather than trying to help the poor minorities.
Yes, great. Thank you, Peggy. So unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank Dr. Empey, Liliana, Linda, Peggy, and D'Angela for being here today and sharing their personal insights with us. I want to also express my gratitude to all of you for your contributions to making our communities safer and more equitable. So Liliana mentioned her clients with imposter syndrome. So I wanted to add that Partners in Diversity did a session on imposter syndrome that was recorded. So if you're interested in listening to that, just let us know and we can send you the link. So today's discussion is a reminder that there are many ways across our organizations where we can lead with empathy and trauma-informed care. So to the attendees, thank you for joining us this morning. Today's conversation is only the beginning. I hope you'll take what you've learned and apply it in the workplace. Please take a few minutes to send us your feedback. A link to a short survey will appear after you leave this webinar, and we would greatly appreciate if you filled it out. It's also posted in the chat box. So again, thank you so much to our panel and to all of you for being here. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.